Good evening, everyone. I'm Gianni Finkelstein, Senior Education Analyst for the Camera Education Institute. Thank you for joining us for this crucial and eye-opening webinar tonight. We're here to gain a deeper understanding of the growing issues within independent and private schools and how these trends are shaping what is being taught and framed across the country in all K-12 educational settings. This discussion is important not just for those directly involved in these schools, but for anyone who cares about the future of education and the integrity of what our children are learning. We're happy to have with us tonight Ashley Jacobs, the founder of Parents Unite, who has spent over 20 years working to improve K-12 education as a board member of independent schools and education-based organizations before launching Parents Unite in 2021. Previously, Ashley worked for the Gillette Company and was an MBA admissions interview board member for Harvard Business School, where she interviewed and evaluated business school applicants. She received a BA from Brown University and was a 4-year varsity athlete and captain of the women's varsity squash team. Ashley holds an MBA from Harvard Business School and lives in Boston with her husband and their 4 children. Her wealth of experience and knowledge will guide us tonight through this critical conversation. We welcome your questions and we will try to address as many as possible. In addition, at the end of tonight's session, we'll open the floor for more Q&A with all the audience, where Ashley will answer your questions about the issues facing independent and private schools and share her insights on how we can begin to shift the culture in these institutions and schools in general. This webinar is essential for anyone concerned about the future of education in this country, whether you're a parent, educator, policymaker, or just someone passionate about preserving the integrity of our education system. We hope that by the end of today's discussion, you will walk away with a deeper understanding of these issues and the tools to make a real difference. Thank you again for being here. And with that, let's get started. Welcome, Ashley.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So Ashley, to frame our conversation for tonight, could you explain what are independent and private schools and how are they different from public schools?
Thank you. So just to give a really basic overview, independent schools are technical terms for nonprofit private schools that are independent in philosophy and each driven by a unique mission. They're governed by independent board of trustees, primarily supported through tuition payments and charitable contributions, and they're accredited by state-approved accrediting bodies. Having said that, let's sort of go a little deeper into the operating system, because I think that that's going to be really helpful as we frame the conversation for tonight. Because while relatively simple, because these schools are people businesses, things become quite complex. So to start, let's go to the governance model. Governance model means that these boards of trustees are people who tend to be parents, mostly parents, donors, and increasingly DEI activists. They write their own bylaws, they select their own people, and are accountable to themselves, which is sort of interesting. The composition has changed over the past, few decades. And while they've included more diversity, it actually hasn't included viewpoint diversity. And in fact, because they've added more diversity and DEI activists, it's chilled the speech of many of the boards. The nominating committee of the board is arguably the most important board committee. It's really responsible for proposing and vetting new board members. And even one activist trustee can derail a school. Boards are primarily performative. Trustees are busy people. Most don't have backgrounds in education. They meet approximately once a month and they receive highly curated agendas in the form of really updates. Trustees are risk averse and conflict avoidant. The real work is done in committees. The executive committee often functions as a mini board, but in the end, good leadership is really critical. And what that means is if you have a good board chair, the board chair should be working really closely with the head of school to shape the agenda. And I think that as we will see further on in the conversation, that may not be happening as much as we'd like. The board has 3 main jobs. The first one is to uphold the school mission. And trustees really have to understand the school mission and ensure that it's central to all decisions. They also should really understand the history of the mission and any changes made to it. There has been a lot of mission creep, as we will continue to discover. Their other main job is overseeing the head of school. This means they hire and fire and oversee their only employee. Trustees are responsible for setting goals and evaluating the board and the head of school. I think one of the things that people maybe don't understand about boards is they're really not involved in operational decisions by design. They're given sort of a guide of best practices by NAIS, which we'll get to, which does give them helpful hints about how to be a good trustee, which really is meant to support the head of school. But having said that, the way they support the head of school is by setting appropriate goals to evaluate the head of school and make sure that the head of school is surrounding him or herself with the best possible people who are helping the school serve the children the best way they can. And then finally, acting as the school's fiduciary. Trustees really obviously have to understand the budget and the financial fitness of the school. The levers obviously are tuition and donations, really. These are private schools, which is why they are allowed to do whatever they want, and they're not really beholden to any government. Except quality control, accreditation. I guess if you were going to say you had some sort of oversight, it would be in the form of accreditation. Accreditation is a credentialing process. It's meant to verify that schools meet certain academic and institutional standards. It's really intended to ensure that independent schools fulfill their unique missions. Schools undergo a detailed self-study every 10 years to get and remain credentialed. They're assessed by their peers on the accrediting team against their missions, which are vague and ambiguous. So you can imagine this is a bit of a flawed process with blatant conflicts of interest, and it lacks transparency. Rather than working to help schools meet certain academic standards and uphold their unique missions, accreditation has actually become a tool used to coerce schools into becoming agents of social change. And it's interesting that accreditation reports aren't just displayed in the lobby of the schools for the world to see. And in fact, we think it's really important that parents ask to read their school accreditation reports and see if the school allows them to read it. That's an interesting sign that maybe something isn't going the way it should be. Who does the accrediting? So up until 2018, NAS was really responsible for doing it, but they switched to the International Council Advancing Independent School Accreditation. And this is now the agency that's going to provide that has been providing quality assurance and accountability for the accreditation programs. There's been a lot of conversation around NAS lately. And again, we'll get to that a little bit later, just what the conversation is about, but just to understand sort of where NAS fits into this whole conversation. NAS is not the accrediting agency anymore. They used to be. Like I said, ICA-ISA, which is International Council Advancing Independent School Accreditation, was formally established in 2018 to provide that role. NEIS is a nonprofit membership association. It provides services to more than 1,900 schools and associations of schools in the US and abroad, including more than 1,600 independent private K-12 schools in the US. On their website, their mission reads, quote, "As the largest association of independent schools, NAIS co-creates the future of education by uniting and empowering its community. They do this through thought leadership, research, creation, and curation of resources and direct collaboration with education leaders." However, NAS prioritizes DEI to all its member schools with respect to professional development, conferences, speakers, and other resources. Member schools are granted access to easily accessible resources that many schools depend on. These include professional development, curriculum, events and conferences, job postings, and more. Unfortunately, these resources have been carefully curated and do not represent viewpoint diversity. Also, NAS lobbies on behalf of its member schools, right? I mean, these schools, have been around for hundreds of years and they've remained independent, and that's takes work with the government when you have large endowments and you have a tax-free status and, very little accountability. And so we have to keep that in mind. But through the accreditation programs, they maintain a set of guiding principles that serve as a foundation for the recognition process. And it's important to just point out a couple of these that'll help us throughout the conversation. This is what they say that they're doing. So for teaching and learning, the school's program must align with its mission and is congruent with the principles of academic integrity, permitting and encouraging freedom of inquiry, diversity of viewpoints, and independent and critical thinking, which actually contradicts their next core value, which is essential commitments to strategic thinking and action, promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. The association articulates and demonstrates its commitment to these values through the accreditation process, guided by the missions of both the association and its member schools. Why do independent schools matter? Of these schools, which educate less than 1 million students, because it's who they educate. These are the children of the elites. These are producing graduates who have outsized influence on most of our important institutions, and what they do, other schools follow. These schools feed the elite universities, and the secondary schools are college preparatory schools, so the students need to be prepared for the indoctrination they will receive.
Thank you, Ashley. And we'll come back to that sort of contradiction about the essential commitment to strategic thinking and the teaching and learning. That sounds like an interesting point to come back to. So with that, I wanted to frame it in experience in public schools. The next question. So working in public schools, we often analyze data to guide our work, identifying and addressing academic gaps. And so we would implement programs to address the gaps such as math and English language arts tutoring during early release days, summer enrichments to prevent academic regression, or community-based parent workshops. And at a certain point in public schools, I noticed that the change of looking at the data, the questions shifted, increasingly focused on examining our racism as teachers and school leaders, or watching classroom videos where student disruptions were accepted and presented as being culturally sensitive. The solutions to address the academic gaps became less relevant. It was more about blaming our alleged stereotypes and lack of cultural understanding. And the resources shared by the public schools centered on anti-racist pedagogies, and some felt even an anti-American or even a Marxist bent. So the change was evident. I experienced it within the public schools. So why and how were independent and private schools foundational in starting to have that happen in their schools and to promote a certain ideologies and curricular materials within K-12 schools?
Well, it's interesting because this has been going on for decades, actually, in private schools. And in fact, over 20 years ago, Heather McDonald wrote an article called The Prep School PC Plague. And her thesis was the bad ideas that were prevalent in higher education have trickled down to these prep schools. And if we look at how that happened, we have to go back to the accreditors. New England Association of Schools and Colleges actually accredits K through 12, but they also are linked to NESHE, which is the New England Commission of Higher Education that accredits colleges. So imagine K through 16 all together linked. They shared office space, actually outside of Boston. And these are the people that really were pushing the DEI bureaucracy, right? Because if you think about it, you're preparing kids for college. So the colleges have in mind what they want. They'll tell the K-12, this is what we're looking for. So the K through 12 people have to give the students that these colleges want. So they feed these people, they feed these schools. They're incentivized to try to solve all of society's problems by becoming agents of social change. Western values had been denigrated. And I think that it has been a long time in the making. And we can go into some of the slides, actually. Patrick, maybe put up, there's a slide, we talk about NAIS and the People of Color Conference, which was sort of the latest and greatest from NAIS, but that stuff's been going on for decades. And in fact, NAIS was targeting anti-Semitism as a problem, same way as most of the country always has, as coming from the right. They had a speaker in February of 2020 that I just went back and did some research on, and the talk was really called Confronting Hate in Our Schools, and all from the lens of decoding white nationalist rhetoric. So trying to help students and teachers identify the white nationalists in the school, code words like when we encourage our guys to go to the Young Republicans Club and start broaching identitarian nationalist ideas, like these are the things that teachers need to be on the lookout for. You can go to the next slide, Patrick. And it just tells you that, in all these schools, NAS was approaching this anti-Semitism issue as, really the white guy, the white nationalist guy, he was the bad guy. And this is the problem that they were really focused on, white nationalist ideology. And again, it's from Southern Poverty Law Center, because that was the reputable institution that told NAS who the bad guys were, blah, blah, blah. And so this is what was going on in the private schools, even 5, 10, 20 years ago. But at the same time, Jewish organizations have tirelessly advocated for social justice too, right? So I just mentioned that the schools were advocating for it, the Jewish organizations were advocating for it. But when we break down the word social justice, it's a little bit of an oxymoron, right? Because justice is meant to be fair and impartial. So why does it need a modifier? The modifier here, social, means that justice has to be served for all marginalized people. Jews probably thought they were in that group, right? Because you have to serve justice for the marginalized people who are fighting systemic inequities and structures. So that's sort of setting the stage for where we are.
So let's go back before we delve a little bit into more of the anti-Semitism and anti-Israel topic. Let's go back to that. I'm really curious about if anybody has noticed and really realized that in one set of the teaching and learning expectation is sort of viewpoint diversity and diversity of perspectives, and yet they were also instituting sort of the DI diversity, but it really didn't mean the diversity of viewpoints, and then equity where you're expected to have the same results, and also inclusion and justice. And within that also, could you just also comment on the fact that these schools are very academically challenging, and the academics were not really meant to be decreased, because then what was the point of these schools to really feed the more selective colleges? So how does equity fit into this? Because in schools, in public schools, you're really trying to really address the gaps. And so the idea how the goal is really for all the students to end up in the same place, and there's the tracking in courses, et cetera, that are implemented. But how does this all fit within the context of a selective, highly selective, or very academic private independent school?
One of the many hypocrisies, right? Parents send their kids to these elite private schools to get ahead. Equity is the opposite of that. If you ask a school, equity, why are you focusing on equity? They would define it, well, we would just want to make sure everybody has, access to equal opportunities, which is not true in a private school. It's highly selective. Not everybody can go. Not everybody can pay for it. So that's just garbage. I think that, a lot of the schools, as they've tried to distance themselves optically from DEI, that's been a word that they've eliminated from the website, because I think even they caught on that that was just so absurd to be promoting for a private school. So then they went, community and inclusion, or diversity and belonging, or, a whole bunch of other things. But the E has sort of quietly been moved from some of the more rigorous schools. A lot of schools are still using it, but it's quite silly.
Oh, that's important. So, which leads us to think about our next topic in our conversation tonight, Ashley. So, how did all this culture change in the private and independent schools open the doors for anti-Semitism and this anti-Israel ideology that we see today, or contemporary anti-Semitism, which, as you mentioned, was not really being addressed at NAIS? And maybe we should leave the slides, because you might go into some of this topic. So let's leave the slides for now. And
So
you can
I think, oh yeah. So I think for a lot of people, the 2016 election was really pivotal in all of this sort of coming out into the open. Because again, we've acknowledged that DEI has been in these schools for years. It's been embedded. It's been in various stages, some of it performative, some of it really, full on, like Exeter, Andover were some of the real pioneers in this field. But the 2016 election is really when the boundaries were broken, because if you remember, maybe if you had kids in school at the time, the teachers all came into school the next day crying, handing out Kleenex in the hallway, classes were canceled. I mean, it was just shock to a lot of these children who were sort of like, wait, what's happening? I'm just trying to go to math class. And the teachers just sort of let their beliefs suddenly be known. Whereas before it was maybe a little bit more covert. Suddenly the floodgates were open and everybody knew where everybody stood in the school. And there was really only one viewpoint that was acceptable for these schools. So that was the first piece. So then I think after George Floyd that summer, there was a very well orchestrated Black at Instagram campaign that hit pretty much every private school. We can talk about the origins of that. It's less important, sort of who was behind it, but more important what it resulted in, which was that it was a big extortion plot, essentially, for every private school in the country who was faced with this reckoning by disgruntled alumni who suddenly came forward with stories about how horrible their experience had been even though they'd never really complained after graduating and all had great college acceptances and were succeeding and doing well in life, but that's a different story. So the Black at Instagram campaign really added accelerant to the fire. I think that people really doubled down on DEI plans. They did equity audits. They really wanted to understand the nature of the problem at the school. And there was a lot of popular opinion behind that. What people failed to realize was BLM, which was the driving force behind a lot of this, was very aligned with the pro-Palestine movement, right? Like you've heard people say you declare your pronouns, you take a knee and you wear a keffiyeh. I mean, like that was happening that summer. If you look at all the people protesting, the keffiyehs were everywhere. I think a lot of people, actually, there's some good slides, Patrick. Would you put up 3 and 4, please? So if you think about the summer of 2020, it was like activism ignited all of this social justice stuff that was sort of quiet on campus, but it gave real fuel to the fire. And some of the things we picked out just were sort of lessons from the Palestinian struggle. It can be crucial for success of the anti-racism uprising in the United States. And then there was just, you know, the Instagram reckoning on race rocks all the Tony private schools, and all these kids had demands about what would have to happen to make them happy and go away quietly. And then there's another slide, Patrick, that just gives you more sort of ideas about what these people at the BLM world were thinking. And these are the same people, a lot of these people at schools had the BLM signs up in their lawns, thinking they were being helpful and virtuous. And so this is sort of the environment in the summer of 2020. And then we also have to realize that COVID happened. So we have like the perfect storm of a lot of things going on. The heads of school were just trying to figure out what to do. Should they open? Should they not? How do we do online learning? What types of, mitigation factors do we need to put in place to be able to get students to school or to be remote, blah, blah, blah. It was very stressful for those of you who are involved. I was involved. It was a lot of work. And so the heads of school are doing that, but then you had this whole DEI explosion, George Floyd, everybody's angry. The good news for all these heads of school is they'd already had the DEI bureaucracies in place. Up until that point, they hadn't had a lot to do, right? It was performative. They'd do a few things. They'd go to a couple conferences. They'd have some speakers in, but it was just relatively harmless in some ways. But when the heads of school said, DEI people, you got to go take this piece because I'm too busy trying to get this school up and running in a pandemic, the DEI people took it literally. They went rogue. They seized the moment. This was their opportunity to get seats at the table where all the important decisions were made, right? They put out the call for equity audits. We need more DEI, we need plans, we need inclusion, we need belonging. And, there's examples of schools that wouldn't open for the entire year because they were whatever, too busy, but they had the time and the resources to put together like 80-page DEI plans. And you think, where are the priorities of these schools? So then let's go to another slide, Patrick, the next one. And so again, when we go back to sort of the groundwork that had been laid for this whole fire to erupt, I would go back to Milton in January of 2022. They were advertising for an upper school math teacher. And if you read the job description, this is upper school math at Milton, elite private school, right? The department is actively working to decolonize mathematics education, build culturally responsive classrooms, and improve equity and access in the field of mathematics for all students, right? Oh, don't go to that one yet. We don't need that one yet. And so we're going to commit to a variety of professional development opportunities to further these goals. We welcome candidates with an active interest in cultivating skills and practice, blah, 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 blah. But you have to have a commitment to anti-racist pedagogy and justice-facing curriculum design and experience and expertise as a thoughtful educator. Okay, so this is like the very beginning of 22. And this is an elite private school telling you they got to decolonize math, which basically means get rid of all white people that have ever had anything to do with math and redo something with it. I don't fully get it, but you get the gist. So again, we've acknowledged that heads of schools are overworked. They've got people coming from them from all directions, right? So you're not doing enough in DEI. You're doing too much DEI. They were making announcements the summer of George Floyd at every major event that happened in the country. They put out a press release or a statement. And at some point, there were so many issues that I think they finally got the message that unless something is directly affecting your school or the people at your school, you should probably just shut your mouth because it's not worth the political capital that you're expending and everyone's going to be mad at you for something. And so all of these heads of schools decided after that summer that they were just going to stop commenting on, these events. Okay, so I guess we'll do one more slide. Yeah. So then what happened, Janie, is you've decided as a head of school that you're going to stop weighing in on events that don't necessarily affect your school. And then October 7th happens, and the schools were caught flat-footed because they didn't know what to do. They didn't have a response. They were sort of done, making public statements about all these horrible things that are happening in the world. But they had parents that wanted to know something, right? And they had librarians and teachers that felt that they needed to do something. So whereas the heads of school didn't do anything, the people in the schools were doing something. So here's an example of a library display after October 7th at Milton Academy. And for those of you who can't see it, because it's probably small on Zoom, it's a lot about Hamas, and it's quite pro-Palestine. And, if you were a student at the school, you'd go in and you'd be like, huh, I could really learn a lot about Hamas. And I'm guessing it's probably fairly positive, maybe. I didn't read those books.
I see Linda Sarsour's book being
Yeah.
placed there.
Yeah. And so the next slide, Patrick. And so that was the library. And then, then the teachers in school are sort of like, wait, I don't know who to call. Like, what are the resources available to me? I haven't had professional development on this, but I have to say something. So they go online, they get, lousy resources because they don't have like the go-to source. And so they pick stuff up and they put together whatever they can to teach the children. Most of it isn't great. Most of it is wrong, historically inaccurate. And unless you have the Jewish kid in your 8th grade class who's going to say, wait, no, that's not correct. They're just going to teach it the way they teach it. Now, is it all malintent? I don't know. Maybe some of it is. Some of it's just ignorance. Some of it's just trying to react to a situation. These schools have been teaching suffocating empathy for so long that I feel like some of these people really believe they have to empathize with terrorists and all the bad people to make themselves feel better. But so I think that the big issue here really is that there's just the lack of high quality fact-based information and sources from which to draw. And then the activist teachers who seize the moment to show their empathy and their true colors. And so, they're still going to justify all this DEI is that DEI is our greatest strength. It leads to better outcomes. We've forced it upon the students in an attempt to prepare them for life after school, for a world that doesn't look like our school. And, the question we all have to start asking ourselves is, have outcomes improved? Has anyone asked? Is there data? And when you think about all this, DEI really is the permission structure that makes anti-Semitism socially acceptable. And we can go on a little bit about that.
So I'm curious about the teachers in all of this, because for sure, we have been researching this issue of anti-Semitism in schools and sort of the promotion of curriculum that didn't have accuracy, historical accuracy, and that were promoting a certain image about Israel and also about the Western world. And so where do teachers fall in all of this, in this sort of promotion or the freedom to promote this anti-Semitism? Because, in public schools, teachers are sort of protected with the anti-Semitism issues that they may have by the union, and also they're tenured. So they really are sort of unmovable in a way, working with parents and schools where issues are happening with teachers even before October 7. It is very hard. So what about anti-Semitism coming from the teachers themselves, their own bias, their own stereotypes about Jews, or their own bias about the way they were trained in schools of education, or the curricular materials that they decided to bring into the classroom or books?
I mean, it's a great point, right? Independent schools, you can do pretty much whatever you want. Teachers have different kinds of training. Many of them start at these schools as, fresh college graduates who are then mentored and trained and rise up through the ranks through the other teachers. They can create their own lessons. They create their own lesson plans. They can choose the books that they assign. I think that for many of them, Middle Eastern studies was probably not something most of them knew much about. There probably aren't that many Jewish teachers or faculty members at a lot of these schools. So again, we can sort of debate whether it was malintent, ignorance, or a little bit of both. But I think, in my experience, what I think is just there's just no resources. Like even me, as someone who's trying to help parents who were calling me incessantly after 10/7, like, what do I do? Where do I get sources? How do I talk to my kid about this? Like, what does it all mean? It's very complicated. I even had to struggle to find resources. Like, who's my go-to source? Like, I can call Camera for certain things, but like, I need curriculum. I need like a fact sheet. I need question. What does this mean? Who's Hamas? Why are they bad? Like, blah, blah, blah. Just basic, like 101 stuff. So that didn't exist. And then, you hear stories about schools in New York City who always exceed expectations. And, they had faculty members that were blaming wealthy and influential Jewish parents for the tensions at the school that were caused after, 10/7. And then you would hear stories about other schools that were sort of encouraging the hiring of, anti-Israel writers and activists from CARE or other organizations. Now, do these schools do that because this is all they know or because they have a particular DEI focus that is, sympathetic to this? Who knows? But the point is that we have not, I believe, this is my personal opinion, and you can feel free to disagree. I don't think the Jews have done the best job sort of telling our story the way we want it told in a way that is simple, digestible, and easily accessible and promotable, right? So again, if NAIS, if I were to go to their website, which I did right after the 10/7 thing, it took them a little bit of time to put up the resources for educating about anti-Semitism. But if you look at the resources that they're providing to all their schools, they're terrible. I mean, it's like ADL stuff. It's like facing history stuff. It's like a little Holocaust stuff. It's like quite predictable, but it's work for teachers to then have to take all that stuff and figure out, like, what do I do in the moment? How do I teach this? Because it is very complicated and it's very fraught with emotion. And as much as we talked about earlier that there's parents who love DEI and hate DEI, you've got like, Jewish families, you've got like a lot of Muslim families. And then they'll say, well, anti-Semitism, but Islamophobia and anti-Palestine racism. And so, head of school is like, wait, what do I do? Like, I got this constituent over here who's angry and this one's angry. And I'm just trying to be all things to all people. And I don't know enough about the conflict. And then it explodes. And then you get trouble that we saw on the cover of many newspapers.
And did boards get involved? Did, the chair of the boards get involved in all of this? It was really just for the head of school and the DEI department to handle.
So that's a great question. So the board should not be involved in operational things. But the precedent was set after George Floyd, where I think boards were brought in because it was like crisis management, right? And you hire a crisis manager. And also you have board members who, like I said at the beginning, were very focused on DEI. This was their thing. And you probably have your DEI person on the board as like leadership for that department. And so those people weren't really speaking up about this at this point. The parents on the board who have children at the school weren't really loud initially because they're very scared to speak up. The boards confer status. Nobody wants to rock the boat. We've acknowledged that most board members are risk averse and conflict avoidant. So they weren't really going to say anything, I think, until things got to a point where enough Jewish parents at the schools made a big stink. Then suddenly boards actually had to listen and pay attention. But that is a good point. What would the role be in that situation when they maybe taken opinions or taken stands or been very involved in the DEI plans previously, and then this happens? What should the response have been? Did anybody handle it well? Some schools handled it well, right? Like, so Milton, I bashed earlier with the slides showing the library, but to their credit, they took it down. The head of school listened to the parents, understood. They tried to bring people together. They've tried to do things to appease certain parents. And then the minute they appease that group, then the other group on the other side comes at the head of school and says, wait, no, now you're discriminating against me. So it's kind of a mess, but they've kind of gotten themselves into this mess by spending so much time and energy dividing their campus into identity groups.
So let me ask you a question in things that were impacting schools, for a long time that have been reported for many years. So there were reports dating back more than 2 decades about the Middle East curriculum and teacher trainings for K to 12 schools from university departments of Middle East studies. They were funded by Saudi Arabia, and later, as we find closer to today, the Qatar took the lead. Because these departments were federally funded, the programs had to do outreach to the American public. And so the materials and the teacher trainings could be slipped into K to 12 schools without the regular vetting, and were promoted by interest groups, sort of flying under the radar. So they did not include lessons on contemporary topics in the Middle East that addressed Islamist fundamentalism, or the lack of democracy in some of these Middle East countries, or the lack of legal rights for women. And they also became prominent as a response to 9/11, so including blaming the Middle East problems on Western colonization. Some even blamed 9/11 of these curricular materials on America's support for Israel and Israel's so-called global influence as pretext for the attack on American soil on 9/11. And in general, these programs have been found to have specific political agendas, such as framing lessons presenting the Middle East only as being invaded without true historical accounts. And in addition, contrary to a liberal value of separating church and state, a state teacher union convention recently promoted Islamic religious beliefs and the distribution of Qurans by a political organization. Some observers remarked that if the convention had similarly promoted Christianity or Judaism or Hinduism, there would have been an uproar. So there's a really serious question about the status of church and state separation and whether all religions are being treated the same. And so were independent schools vulnerable to these curricular materials and teacher trainings coming out 2 decades ago from the Middle East departments and the organizations? They certainly were coming into the public schools, and Camera did report even on some of these courses in public schools, but were they coming in decades ago also into private schools?
I mean, it's hard to say, right? Think about most of these private schools were actually founded on Judeo-Christian values. Like, this is who they are from their core. Curriculum changes at these schools. Depending on the school, there's electives. For example, they may have like a semester of Middle Eastern history. It depends on the teacher. It depends on so many things. There's no standard that they have to comply with, right? Because they're an independent school, they can do what they want. I always recommend that parents should ask to see the syllabus for the year, to see the books that the kids are reading, to talk to the teacher when you have back to school night or when you have your parent-teacher conferences, because my feeling is that they should share the syllabus with you, and they should share the stuff that the kids are doing, and you should know the books that they're reading. They should be proud of it. If they're not proud of it, they shouldn't be teaching it. And that's an important thing to know. And, so many of these private schools say they want to be partners with the parents. And so see if that's true. But I do think that you should have access to the curriculum and to the syllabus. And if you don't, I would be surprised if you didn't go to ask like your head of the division for it, if they didn't give it to you.
Well, I mean, it's interesting you point this out. I think we need to move. This conversation is so engaging and so informative, but given the interest of time, I think we should switch about. So what are successful strategies to really shift the culture of the K to 12 independent and private schools and really address all of these ideological sort of systems that have come in, and also to address anti-Semitism? What would you give? And there's, some questions sort of about, what should parents do? Because some of them actually have tried. There are questions in the audience. They have tried to actually ask the private schools, what is the curriculum you're using? And they haven't really been successful in having access to that.
Well, that's shocking to me. I would be curious what schools aren't giving you. And maybe it's not asking about the curriculum. It's just like, what are you teaching? What's the lesson plan? If it's a history course, you can read, you can see what your kids are doing. You can talk to your kids, like, what'd you learn in history class today? They should be able to tell you. The bigger issue is DEI. And I know there was a New York Times article that was going around today, actually, in one of our chat groups, and it got to be a little heated. Because I think there's two groups of people. There are some people that believe that, the Jewish students and Jewish people should be integrated into DEI, and I am completely opposed to that. I think DEI needs to go. Because as I said earlier, it's the permission structure because of the oppressor-oppressed binary that allows anti-Semitism to be socially acceptable. Like, it's cool to say, yeah, the Jews are bad guys. They're the oppressors. Look how, overrepresented they are in positions of power and influence, given how small of a group of people they are. That's not right. So we got to get rid of DEI. And we got to get rid of the focus on social justice and placing groups, either as oppressed or oppressor, and then stop talking about identity and get rid of the affinity groups. Let the kids be kids, let them grow and develop age appropriately. Like that's how you turn the culture. But then as far as, what you do in school, like tactically to start to really move the needle and make some progress, Janie and I talk about this all the time. The schools are really good at educating about Holocaust education, right? Like, everybody reads Anne Frank and Knight and Mouse. It's really important, obviously, to have that as a foundation, but that can't be the only way that they talk about, Jews and Israel and history. And so I think having sources that are inspirational, accurate, easy to digest, readily available, those are the things I think we need to find somebody, maybe Camera can do it, to really do and promote, because there isn't enough good scholarship out there that is accurate to teach the children, especially as they get to be older, right? Because I think a lot of these topics don't really come up probably till high school in most schools, right? Just given the scope and sequence of most schools, a lot of the anti-Semitism stuff that's related to the DEI is coming in from different channels. And then, going back to NEIS and this People of Color conference and the annual conference they have all these horrific speakers that come, but has anybody like raised their hand, from our side to come and speak about Israel or about like successful, Jewish people who've done great things in the world and, maybe like the conflict from a different lens, right? Like, I don't know that we've had enough people pushing our story and trying to get involved in these types of conferences. And I guess contra to that, imagine what would happen if you did try and then you got rejected. Then you really would have a claim of anti-Semitism. So before we, accuse everybody of being evil and anti-Semitic all the time, I think we have to try to see that they take our side of the conversation as readily and easily as they take, sort of the anti-Israel, anti-Zionist side. And then I think also anti-Semitism looks really different at every school. And in some ways, it's a little bit like the boogeyman, right? And so we have to sort of say, like, there's obviously the overt stuff, right, with Fieldston, where they had graffiti on the front door that was offensive, and it was student-led. You have to sort of define what it is. Like, is it overt? Is it nuanced? Is it subtle? Is it conspiracy theories about Jews? Like, what is it? And when we know what it is, we have to call it out, but call it out and then just give the counterpoint, right? Like, because again, to a lot of these schools, I don't know for sure it's malicious. The overt stuff for sure is, but a lot of the stuff that's happening in the classroom is just because people get terrible sources and they don't really know that it's wrong and they don't really know what to say about it. And I think that so many of the legacy Jewish organizations are still really focused on this right-wing anti-Semitism problem, which has always been a problem, will always be a problem, but it's a very small subset of the population. What we've seen in the growth post 10/7 has really come from, the progressive side of the world and all of the elites in higher education, as we've seen on college campuses, and that inevitably trickles down to high schools, and people are fired up about that. So really, it's just flooding the zone with recommended books and thought leaders and speakers and articles, applying to all the conferences, and then finding board members who are aligned and you can get to speak up, because this is the other problem is if the board members aren't even willing to speak up and sort of take a stand, then, I don't really know how much hope I would have for your school, because at some point you have to put a stake in the ground and be willing to vote with your feet and your wallet. And if you don't, nothing's really going to change.
There's a good question actually related to strategies and solutions, because I think post 10/7, it's time to really think about, okay, what can we do to really address this and really preventative measures so it's not always us reacting. Same thing with public schools. And there's a great question about like supporting and educating the kids. What about the kids? There are efforts that, one of our participants is sharing how they're really working with the kids. Can the kids within these schools also sort of be the ones that are the agents of change? And how could that happen? How could they be the agents of change within the structure of these private schools? And are they more hindered? Because, we've worked together sometimes with parents across the country, Ashley, that bring to us, issues and challenges they're having in the private and independent schools. And I find that compared to working with parents that are facing challenges in public schools, they're a little bit more hesitant to really speak up. They're more concerned because really, it's very different. They can just be out the door if they don't like the way the school is sort of being focused on goals that don't align with what the parent really wants to see happen in the school. And so the parents are less likely, but can the kids be? Can you comment about that? And have you seen it happen in these private independent schools?
It's
That's a
hard,
great
right? And
question.
again, if we go back to the 2016 election, I think that was the signal to any kid that wanted to speak up against DEI or anything that was, contrary to like the one world view that they'd been taught. Like these kids saw that and they're like, I'm out. I'm not saying anything. I'm going to write the paper. My teacher wants to read. I'm all about race, gender, and climate. I'm all in. I'm going to express my fealty to all that. Hell yeah. So that is where these kids have been living. And it's a really scary place because they want to get a good grade. They want to get into a good college. They know the teachers, how they feel about things. So if you have those teachers, you're going to give the teacher what they want, and you're not going to be the outlier. Now, I will say after the recent election, I think it's given some kids some cover to start to breathe a little bit and start to tell the truth about some certain things, especially now that the executive orders are flying out of the White House, which is wild. And it's not clear how all of these, I think, are going to affect the private schools yet, but certainly if we look around at corporate America and the government, DEI is not favored anymore. And so when we go back to the purpose of these schools, many of these schools justify the DEI as, well, we're just preparing the children for a world that doesn't look like us. We got to prepare them for college. But if DEI is no longer in favor of corporate America or college, then what do you need to prepare the kids for anymore, right? And then you can make the case, well, there's an opportunity cost because now you're spending all this time and energy on this stupid thing that's now extinct and nobody wants anymore. So how are we going to fill that time? So I think we have a window of opportunity to start to fill that time with alternatives and, programming and lessons and things that are positive and value added and will make the kids smarter and potentially unite them as opposed to the garbage that they've been fed, for the past however many decades.
There are questions also about Jewish day schools, and I think we need to clarify Jewish day schools are considered private schools. I think that about 60 are part of NAIS when I looked at the data. And what is interesting when looking at, Jewish day schools, and they fall within all the, sort of different denominations. In response to October 7, many Jewish day schools carefully considered how to present this massacre to students, determining appropriate ways to discuss it in classrooms. They also assessed and considered potential adjustments to the Israel education programs for middle school and high school students. And they also added more literature for young adults in the classroom connected to Israel. And interestingly, and so in terms of knowledge of Jewish day schools that have actually been more aligned with more of the progressive anti-racist education, there could have been tensions around, how they present the Palestinian narratives, how they present the history of Israel, and where they fall about how to bring too many politics into the classroom and whether teachers were bringing their own preconceived ideas in a way that wasn't really objective about the history of Israel. So more than that, I would like us to focus on something very interesting. The head of school of a Jewish day school in Tennessee was really determined to be a resource of support for Jewish students in other independent schools, and so that were not attending Jewish day schools. And so over 2 weeks, he sent emails to heads of schools of other independent and even public schools in the area and offered perspective on the conflict in Israel and encouraged each of them to look out for their Jewish students and families, and also offered for their teachers to be a contact. So is there a role for Jewish day schools? We talk so much about Jewish organization, and of course, it is so important, the work that Jewish organizations do in terms of, providing resources. But what about partnerships with Jewish day schools? Could they also be sort of within a certain area, be the ones that bring in teachers from these independent schools and provide more direct training as teacher to teacher, head of school to head of school? What do you think about that?
I mean, they could, but again, these schools are busy. These heads of schools are juggling so many jobs now. It's a really hard job. Turnover is a lot faster than it used to be. So yes, I think like in theory, it's a great idea because they are educators. They should be able to educate the rest of the people, but also it has to be a priority with these other schools, right? And unless they're sort of feet to the fire, and unless there's an incident that happens on their campus, like, is there that much of an appetite, right? Like there's some schools that have 9 Jewish kids in the whole school out of a school of 400, right? Like, are they going to really spend the time and the resources worrying about this? I don't know, maybe not, right? But again, this would be the guy that should call up NAIS and say, look, I'm an expert in all these things. Have me at your next conference and I will lead a whole series of professional development seminars, and I will tell you what books to read, and I will help you craft your program, because the stuff you're getting from ADL, it's not super helpful to K through 12 kids, right? So like, yes, we need people to start to lead and start to say, I'm going to raise my hand to help, because I realize that there's such a dearth of information and resources for the people who genuinely want to know and learn.
So, well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because we actually presented and also had a strong booth in terms of the National Council for Teachers of English. It's a conference that usually is attended by 7 to 8,000 teachers nationally, and it's really tailored not only for teachers of English language from K to 12, but also professors that train teachers for schools and also for librarians. And so, what was interesting is we actually interacted with private school teachers and also with public school teachers, and we had reactions that were similar, in terms. I can't say that there was any difference, both from both cohorts, when they were really excited for us to be there and very curious about our literature program and all the curated list of books that we had, really sort of promoting true to life representations of Israelis, the connection of Jews to the land of Israel. And we have books curated for elementary, middle school, and high school, really carefully vetted by our team. And so I didn't see any difference. I did see that they were just as excited, the teachers from the private school. And so NAIS is not the only conference or the only organization that actually could have an impact in these private schools. It could be something just wider reach to all these conferences that are focused in these organizations, depending on the content area. So that I thought was really important. But by the same token, we also had a negative reaction. We were, the some of the activists, teachers and book authors really tried to have us expelled and not be present with the children's books at the conference. And then the reaction for both private school or public school teachers that were sort of negatively reacting to us being there, with their voicing their concerns, and was also equally present. So I can't say that it was any different. But what is interesting to think about is these teachers that go through education schools. We know that also in terms of this ideology of oppressors, and having read Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, which is so prevalent, and liberated ethnic studies curricular, whether it's a model curriculum in California or other areas. Are the teachers coming into the private schools also training these schools of education and subjected to this? Or are they coming from a different cohort? And how are they getting in their training sort of these ideological bents?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of them have been brainwashed because they came from elite private schools. I mean, the private school world tends to be rather insular. And when you're talking about independent schools, a lot of the teachers at independent schools either went to independent schools or went to elite colleges, right? So somewhere along that continuum, you're exposed to all this fabulous nonsense. And so the type of people that are attracted to that have a little disposition, I think. They lean that way. We know that there's no ideological diversity in most of higher ed. So again, people are self-selecting into a profession and they think a certain way. In private schools, again, you don't have to have credentials. Many of them get master's degrees, but many of them don't. And again, it's very school specific. The culture of the school really determines a lot of it. If you have a really great head of school who is very clear about his school and his mission or her mission, they are going to hire the people that are very consistent with that. But if you have a very progressive school, you're going to all have to do your whole DEI fealty exam to apply. Like, that's the same thing that happens in higher ed also happens in the K through 12 schools. So those schools are going to get what they ask for, which is, ideologues.
It is also one of the strategies for private schools and independent schools, sort of exposure. And so there have been many instances in public schools, whether it's public school teachers or curriculum or consultants that come into the schools to do training or get hired. Is there such thing as sort of exposure in the media? We also see it with the teacher unions like the MTA. Does the exposure in the media work? Have you seen concrete examples of this working?
I mean, these salacious stories always make the front cover of like the Post, right? Or some like Vanity Fair. I mean, Town and Country, like everyone loves a great prep school story about, all the bad stuff. And there have been no shortage of scandals, right? Like we've had our share of scandals in these fancy schools, and they always seem to emerge stronger, and parents don't seem to care. And I mean, look at higher ed. We expected maybe applications would suffer a little bit after all the anti-Semitism. No. And yeah, maybe some of the donations dried up, but then people filled those coffers with other donations. So, at the end of the day, the status still matters to a lot of parents, and they still are willing to overlook all of these transgressions in all these schools. And, you get a little bit of a hit in the New York Post for a couple days, and then they hire like the crisis management person to come in, and it all sort of goes away. And then the next one hits and it goes away, and then they fire the head and they get a new head. And, it's quite cyclical. So, I mean, I would love to say that like they're, influenced by bad press, but I think there's so much bad press right now and so much media fragmentation that it's kind of almost like a cost of doing business for these schools.
Is also sort of part of the solution, anything to do with donors, the way we're seeing in the
Yeah.
elite, college campuses, have the donors, alumni or just donors to these schools been able to exert pressure to
Yes.
abandon this anti-Western ideology, oppressed oppressor, and really to address anti-Semitism from within, not just as a reactionary mode.
Yeah, I mean, the two levers you have are voting with your feet and your wallet, right? And so that's definitely happening. I think also the market is adjusting in some ways too, which has been really interesting to watch. A lot of these private schools had been literally like dying on the vine pre-COVID. I mean, enrollment was down, the value proposition wasn't clear. Everyone thought the public schools were so good, and then COVID hit, and then everyone realized the public schools really weren't so good, and the private schools with all their warts, they were still academically better. So it saved a lot of them. But now that we're, several years past the pandemic and things haven't necessarily cooled off as far as the nonsense that they're teaching, people are shifting, they're moving. And while the switching costs are a little higher for private schools, right? Because you've got to apply and you've got to get in, and you've got to move your kid and your family, and you have all your friends at your schools. There are more and more schools that have just distanced themselves from all this nonsense, and they're reaping the rewards of it. I mean, they really are. And I think that the families that opt into those schools are seeing the difference. And then I think teachers want to be part of that too. And so you're seeing teachers maybe move around sort of subtly and slowly. And so things will reset to a certain extent. The incoming administration is incredibly focused on school choice. And so it'll be really interesting to see how that affects this landscape as well, because if there's more and more, federal dollars that are now available to attend, some of these private schools, and now with the mandate, the executive order to get rid of a lot of the DEI, it will force a bunch of schools to get their act together, and the parents will vote accordingly. So I'm a little bit optimistic about that. And then sort of on the converse of that, Janie, you and I have talked about how, given all of the DEI and given how, anti-Western these schools are, in teaching kids to hate themselves, each other, and their country, I'm actually surprised there hasn't been more anti-Semitism. And that makes me feel sort of good, given all of the bad stuff going on, given the media, given the fact that the deck is really stacked against a lot of the narratives that, are being not, our stories that we need to tell. Like I'm sort of hopeful and optimistic that the fact that there isn't more anti-Semitism is, I know that's not like a great way to explain it, but it's sort of a good thing.
Do you mean in the private school and
Yeah.
independent school settings?
Yeah, the little kids. Now, maybe it changes when they get to college and they're with their friends and they've got, all the crazy people encouraging them. But, I have college age kids, and, they say that, as bad as things were on a bunch of campuses, it's such a fringe minority, and they suck all the air out of the room and they get all the attention. But the vast majority of the kids on those campuses are just, they're not in it. They're not feeling it. They want to just put their heads down and do their work.
Well, I mean, the other issue here is also we don't know what is happening in the private and independent schools. Same token with public schools, that there are no Jewish families or Jewish teachers or Jewish board members. And so the idea that, perhaps really in these schools, there needs to be more of an education, not just on Holocaust education when presenting Jews to all these kids in the private and independent schools, but really addressing about who are the Jews and what does Jewish identity mean and what's the history of the Jews, what are the contributions to the Jews to America, to the world, and what are the historical connections of the Jews to their ancient homeland, to Israel, and the history, accurate historical information about the history of Israel. For example, the curriculum that the team at the Camera Education Institute has, posted, and anybody can download for free, and it would be available for any, private and independent school that would like to implement it and also, present it to their students and using the resources. Same thing with the curated list. Parents could also advocate for more books that represent Jews and Israel and Zionism in a manner that is true to life and that really brings the real history of the Jews for their students. Whether there are Jewish kids or not is really not sometimes important, because the school is really presenting an important sort of information about who the Jews are to all students, which is important, not just the massacre that occurred in the Holocaust. So sort of moving on to solutions. The other thing is, that when doing the research about independent schools, there are Jewish organizations that have been involved in training, and this will be, and there are questions in the chat about this. And so some of these Jewish organizations that have provided training, and some of them have done it for schools like Beerley and other very important, and prominent private school, Horace Mann, and they really recommend sort of forming affinity groups and really embedding Jews within the DI framework of the schools to really put a solution or to prevent anti-Semitism. What is your thought of that as a solution?
I just totally don't agree. I don't agree in segregation. I don't agree with racism, which is all of that stuff is. I think that you don't help people get to know you and understand your situation if you separate from them. And I understand that some people feel like, Jews need a safe space to be together. We'll do it after school. But when you're in school, like, go to class, be with your friends, convince people that, you don't need to sit alone at the lunch table. Again, I think we just need to start like tracking all of this stuff, since we've had affinity groups and since we've had all this DEI, like, what are the outcomes? Can we measure? Like, we know that kids are depressed and they're anxious and they're divided like never before. I mean, there's some causality there, I think. And I'd rather have like this Shabbat dinner and invite everybody to come and have really good food. I mean, JD, we were talking about that. Of all the cultures, I mean, we win on the food and just the fun. And so, celebrating that and just inviting more people to join, and not under the rubric of social justice or anything, but just because like this is what we do and it's kind of fun, right? I mean, just being normal, but not like Jewish, but normal. But like then we do all these other great things because of this culture that we're lucky to be a part of. And I think that, affinity groups, you're going to have like 20,000 affinity groups pretty soon, right? Because everybody can check a different kind of a box. And then what if you check two boxes? Like, what if you're Jewish or like, it's too confusing for the kids. We need to move on from it.
So, this conversation is just so interesting. Thank you for all of this important, knowledge-based information and recommendations, Ashley. And we're going to give information at the end to all the participants about, where to reach, where to find Parents Unite, et cetera, and also the Camera Education Institute. So any final thoughts to our conversation, Ashley?
No, I mean, I just think it's really important that people speak up and just sort of take note of what's happening and talk to your teachers if you're concerned about the types of curriculum that you're seeing or the books that you're reading. Talk to your friends. I think that, if you're thoughtful about it, you should be able to have these conversations with your schools. I think a lot of them do want to do the right thing. I really do. I think they just don't know how to do it. And I think there's enough sort of bad actors at some of these schools that have sort of made it, oh, I'm muted. Am I muted? Oh, that have made it a little bit harder for people to approach them. But I think if you get a couple groups together and, if you're approaching it out of true curiosity and wanting to be part of the solution, it would be hard for me to imagine that you will be met with much resistance, because we just want to teach the truth and facts. And I think schools just need help doing that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight, and we hope that you found the information valuable and inspiring. And thank you, Ashley, for an enlightening session and being with us tonight. And so if we could put the slide. So if you'd like to learn more about Parents Unite and the Camera Education Institute, please visit our websites. They're posted on the slide, and also our emails that you could reach us if you have more questions and need more resources. And also thank you everybody for being with us tonight. The Camera Education Institute will offer future webinars focused on education. Your support can make a real difference. Please consider donating to support our work, and take care, and we hope to see you again in future webinars.